The air in Le Jardin Étoile was thick with the scent of aged wine, seared steak, and the faintest hint of lavender from the custom floral arrangements. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the marble floors, and the soft hum of hushed conversations intertwined with the delicate notes of a pianist playing in the far corner. For the elite of New York City, this was just another night of indulgence. For Clara Bennett, it was another long shift of blending into the background. Clara moved through the restaurant with practiced ease, her crisp black uniform a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Her tray balanced effortlessly on her arm as she weaved between tables, refilling glasses and delivering plates with a quiet efficiency that went unnoticed. To the guests, she was just another waitress, a nameless figure in the background, invisible and insignificant. But Clara Bennett was not just a waitress. Once, her name had carried weight. Once, her fingers had danced across piano keys, commanding the attention of sold-out concert halls. Once, she had been a prodigy. That was before the world had taken everything from her. The memory of her past life was a ghost that haunted her every step. At 17, Clara had been on the brink of greatness. A scholarship to the prestigious Juilliard School had been within her grasp, her future as bright as the stage lights that had once illuminated her. But then, like a house of cards collapsing under the weight of a single breath, her world had crumbled. Her father's company, a once thriving tech firm, had been swallowed whole by a ruthless corporate takeover. Lawsuits, debts, and the crushing weight of financial ruin had left her family destitute. The grand piano that had been her sanctuary was sold, a cruel necessity to keep food on the table. The scholarship was revoked, and with it her dreams. Now, at 24, Clara barely recognized the person she had become. Her hands, once capable of coaxing breathtaking melodies from a piano, now carried trays of overpriced wine and gourmet dishes. The piano in the restaurant, a stunning Steinway grand, stood in the corner like a relic from another life, a silent reminder of everything she had lost. She never let herself look at it for too long. Tonight was no different. Clara refilled a guest's wine glass, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. The ache in her chest was a familiar companion, a dull longing she had buried years ago. But there was no room for dreams here. Dreams didn't pay the rent. Clara had accepted her place in this world, or, at least, she thought she had. Because tonight, fate had other plans. The moment Victor Kane walked into Le Jardin Étoile, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. There was something about him, an aura of power that made people straighten their backs and lower their voices. He didn't just enter a room, he claimed it. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no in his life. His reputation preceded him, a self-made billionaire, or so he claimed. Victor Kane had built his empire through high-risk investments, ruthless acquisitions, and a complete disregard for the people he crushed along the way. He was the kind of man who thrived on dominance, who enjoyed reminding everyone just how insignificant they were in his presence. And tonight, Clara Bennett was about to be his next target. Clara noticed him the moment he stepped in, though she pretended not to. Victor was flanked by business partners and a woman in an emerald green dress who clung to his arm, her laughter just a little too rehearsed. He barely acknowledged the hostess before striding toward his usual private table, a corner spot reserved for him whenever he pleased, whether he had a reservation or not. Clara's stomach twisted.
She knew this man.
She had never met him personally, but his name was etched into the darkest chapter of her life. Victor Kane's company had been one of the driving forces behind her family's financial ruin. His aggressive corporate takeovers had collapsed the firm where her father had worked for decades, leaving them drowning in lawsuits and unpaid debts. He had never known her, never seen the destruction his greed had caused. To him, her family had been collateral damage, nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. But tonight, they were no longer strangers. Tonight, their worlds would collide. Victor took his seat, snapping his fingers at a waiter without so much as a glance. His sharp eyes scanned the restaurant, taking in the opulence around him, until they landed on Clara. Something flickered in his expression. Amusement. Interest. He didn't recognize her, of course. But Clara could already feel it in her bones. Before the night was over, he would make her the center of his attention. And it wouldn't be for reasons she would enjoy. Clara kept her head down, focusing on her work, but she could feel his gaze. Victor Kane wasn't the kind of man who simply looked at someone. He assessed them, dissected them with his eyes as if calculating their worth. And right now, she was his subject. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. It was just another night. Just another table. He didn't know who she was.
Yet.
Clara approached his table with practiced grace, her voice steady. Good evening. Can I get you started with anything? Victor leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass before finally speaking. What's your name? Clara hesitated.
She wasn't expecting that.
Clara, she answered simply. Clara, he repeated, as if tasting the name. Tell me something, Clara. What do you do when you're not serving tables? The question sent a chill through her. It was too direct, too intentional. She knew this game. She had seen men like him play it before, a test, a trap, a way to establish control over conversation. I work, she said, keeping her answer neutral. Victor smirked.
A shame.
A face like yours. I would have thought you had bigger dreams. His companions chuckled, his date offering a tight smile, clearly used to his brand of amusement at others' expense. Clara ignored the insult. Would you like to hear night's specials? But Victor wasn't finished with her yet. He leaned forward slightly, a glint of cruel curiosity in his eyes. Actually, I heard something interesting. A little birdie told me that you know how to play the piano. Clara's blood ran cold. She forced a polite smile. I used to. A long time ago. Victor's smirk widened. Perfect. Why don't you play something for us? A flicker of unease spread through the table. His business partners exchanged wary glances, sensing the shift in mood. Clara's fingers tightened around the tray she was holding. I appreciate the thought, sir, but I'm here to work. Victor tilted his head, feigning surprise. Oh, come now. We'd love to hear you. It's not every day we get a chance to witness raw, undiscovered talent. More laughter. More eyes on her. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't a request. It was a demand. A spectacle. Victor wasn't interested in music. He wasn't interested in her talent.
He wanted a show.
He wanted to remind everyone in this restaurant that he held the power. She could refuse. Walk away. But she knew what would happen next. He would make a comment, something sharp, something calculated to humiliate her. He would call her a fraud, accuse her of lying about her talent. The restaurant would whisper about it for weeks. And worst of all, he would win. Clara's stomach twisted. She hadn't touched a piano in years. The thought of playing again, in front of an audience, especially like this, made her want to run. But then, another thought cut through the fear. Why should I be afraid? She had spent years hiding from this world, pretending that the music inside her didn't exist. But it did. It always had. And maybe, just maybe, tonight was the night she took it back. Clara lifted her chin, meeting Victor's expectant gaze. Fine, she said, her voice steady. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He hadn't expected her to accept. Clara set down her tray and turned toward the grand piano. The restaurant fell silent. The moment had arrived. Her footsteps felt heavier than they should have as she approached the piano. The restaurant was silent now, the usual hum of conversation replaced by an eerie anticipation. Every eye in the room was on her. She could feel it, the judgment, the expectation, the amusement. They were waiting for a disaster. Behind her, Victor Kane leaned back in his chair, smug satisfaction written across his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had pushed her into a moment of humiliation she wouldn't recover from. For a split second, she almost let him. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. It had been years since she had last played in front of anyone. She had spent so long running from this part of herself that stepping back into it now felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Her mind was a war zone. What if I fail? What if I've forgotten everything? What if they laugh? Someone in the audience coughed, the small sound cutting through the silence like a blade. The moments stretched longer, the weight of her own hesitation crushing her. And then she remembered. She remembered the way her mother used to watch her practice, eyes full of pride. She remembered the way her father would close his eyes and sway when she played his favorite Chopin nocturne. She remembered the first time she had ever touched a grand piano, how it had felt like coming home. And then she remembered why she had stopped.
The shame.
The loss. The betrayal. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap. No more running. Clara exhaled slowly, her fingers finding their place on the keys. The moment they touched the cool ivory, a strange calm settled over her. Muscle memory kicked in, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. She pressed the first note. A soft, haunting sound drifted through the restaurant, filling the space like a whisper through the dark. The tension in the room shifted. Victor, who had been waiting for a clumsy, embarrassing attempt, frowned slightly. His smirk faltered. Clara's hands moved again, her fingers flowing into the melody, gaining confidence with every note. The piano responded to her like an old friend, its rich tones swelling beneath her touch. The restaurant guests, once entertained by the idea of watching a waitress make a fool of herself, now sat in rapt silence. The music was speaking now, louder than their expectations, louder than their prejudices. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a reckoning. The game had changed. Victor Kane didn't know it yet, but he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The music swelled, filling the restaurant with a haunting beauty that seemed to transcend the room itself. Clara's fingers moved with a life of their own, each note carrying the weight of her past, the dreams she had lost, the pain she had endured, and the fire that had never truly died. The melody was no longer just a song. It was her story, her soul laid bare for everyone to hear. Victor Kane sat frozen in his chair, his whiskey glass forgotten in his hand. The smug satisfaction that had been plastered across his face moments ago was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling: disbelief. His companions, who had been laughing at his jokes just minutes ago, were now transfixed, their eyes locked on Clara as if seeing her for the first time. The restaurant staff, too, had stopped in their tracks. Rodrigo, one of the senior waiters, stood near the kitchen entrance, his tray dangling forgotten at his side. He had worked alongside Clara for years, never once suspecting the talent she had buried beneath her uniform. Now, he watched her with a mixture of awe and pride, as if realizing that a legend had been hiding in plain sight. Clara didn't notice any of it. Her world had narrowed to the piano, the keys, and the music that flowed through her like a river breaking free from a dam. She played with a passion that had been dormant for too long, each note a declaration of defiance, a reclaiming of everything that had been taken from her. As the final chords approached, Clara poured every last piece of herself into them. The music rose, crashing like waves against the shore, before culminating in a bold, unshakable declaration. The last note rang out, echoing through the restaurant like a thunderclap. Then silence. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Victor's jaw was clenched so tight that a muscle ticked in his cheek. His knuckles had gone completely white around his glass. His date, the woman in the emerald dress, was no longer clinging to him. She sat back in her chair, her eyes wide with something that might have been admiration, or perhaps envy. And then a single clap. It came from the older gentleman near the bar, the one who had discreetly wiped at his eyes during Clara's performance. His applause was slow at first, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid to break the spell. But then another clap joined his. And another. And another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as people rose to their feet, their applause thunderous and unrelenting. Some clapped politely, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. Others cheered wildly, their earlier amusement replaced by genuine admiration. A few, like the older man at the bar, simply stood in stunned silence, their hands clasped together as if they had witnessed something sacred. Clara turned on the piano bench, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the reactions of the stunned audience. Some guests were still clapping, their faces alight with a newfound respect. Others whispered among themselves, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. But Clara wasn't focused on them. Her gaze locked onto Victor Kane. He was still seated, still gripping his wine glass, but the smirk was gone. His fingers tapped against the stem of his glass, a nervous tick, perhaps. His expression hovered somewhere between humiliation and disbelief. He had expected to humiliate her. Instead, he had just handed her a stage. And now he had no control over what happened next. Clara rose from the piano bench, her movements slow and deliberate. The weight of every past humiliation she had endured, from Victor, from life itself, seemed to fade with each step she took toward his table. When she stopped in front of him, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm that belied the storm raging inside her. The air between them was thick with tension. "Is this what you wanted, Mr. Kane?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. "Was this the kind of entertainment you were hoping for?" A murmur rippled through the nearby guests. People leaned in, sensing the confrontation. Victor forced out a small laugh, but it lacked his usual confidence. He adjusted his suit jacket, straightened his shoulders, but for once, he wasn't in control. "I have to admit," he said, trying to keep his voice light, "I didn't expect that." "No," Clara agreed. "You didn't. You assumed, like everyone else, that I was beneath you, that I was nothing more than a waitress." Victor's jaw tightened. Clara let the silence stretch between them before finally adding, "I suppose it's a good reminder that wealth doesn't make you the smartest person in the room." A few gasps escaped from the surrounding tables. A couple of suppressed laughs followed. Victor's face darkened, but he had no rebuttal. He had already lost. Before Victor could find a way to regain his footing, another voice entered the conversation. That was extraordinary. Clara turned to see an older man stepping forward from the crowd. He had silver hair, sharp eyes, and an air of quiet authority. She recognized him instantly, a renowned music professor and a patron of the arts. His name was Dr. Richard Langley, and his presence in the restaurant was no coincidence. He had been dining at a corner table, unnoticed until now. "I've seen many pianists in my life," Dr. Langley continued, his voice thoughtful, "but very few can play with that level of passion." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Other guests nodded in agreement, as if finally seeing Clara for who she truly was. Dr. Langley extended a business card, his eyes locking onto hers with intensity that made her breath catch. "I would like to discuss your future in music," he said. Clara hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for the card. A future in music? For so long, she had told herself it was impossible, that the door had closed forever. But now, here it was, opening again. As the weight of the moment settled, Clara gripped the professor's business card, running her thumb over its embossed lettering. The surreal nature of the evening was sinking in, but she had little time to process it. The restaurant's usual rhythm slowly resumed. Waiters returned to their stations, glasses clinked, and hushed conversations filled the air. But something had changed. Clara was no longer just another waitress. She could feel the shift in the way people looked at her now, not as a server, but as an artist. At Victor's table, the tension had turned unbearable. His once lively entourage was now uncomfortably quiet, their previous amusement long gone. His date, the woman in the emerald dress, was no longer draped over him. Instead, she leaned in and whispered something, her tone laced with amusement, perhaps a final jab at his failed stunt. Clara didn't need to hear their conversation to know what was happening. His power over the room had slipped away, and he hated it. Victor took a slow sip of his wine, a pathetic attempt to appear unaffected, before abruptly pushing back his chair. His movements were stiff, calculated, as if forcing himself to maintain composure. But everyone could see it. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his jaw clenched just a little too hard, the way his usual confidence had shattered into something unrecognizable.
Defeat.
Without a word, he tossed a few bills onto the table, nodded stiffly to his remaining guests, and walked out. No grand farewell. No final word. Just quiet humiliation. As Clara turned away from the scene, she caught sight of her coworkers. Rodrigo, one of the senior waiters, grinned at her from the bar. "Didn't know we had a legend working with us," he teased. A few of the other servers clapped her on the back, their faces alight with genuine pride. Even the restaurant manager, who had rarely given Clara a second glance before, looked at her with something that almost resembled respect. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't invisible. Even some customers approached her as she made her way back to the kitchen. An older couple nodded approvingly, one of them whispering, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Clara gave them a small, genuine smile. As Clara changed out of her uniform at the end of her shift, she slipped the professor's business card into her pocket. The thought of calling him felt terrifying, but also exhilarating. She stepped out into the cool night air, tilting her head back to take a deep breath. The crisp autumn breeze wrapped around her, carrying with it the scent of rain and city lights. For years, she had walked this path home, feeling trapped, feeling like she had no choices. Tonight, for the first time, she felt free. Clara sat at the small wooden table in her apartment, the dim glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Dr. Langley's business card lay in front of her, its pristine white surface stark against the worn tabletop. She had stared at it for hours, tracing the elegant black letters over and over. Dr. Richard Langley, chair of the music department, Juilliard School. The night at the restaurant still played in her mind like a vivid dream. The shock in Victor's face, the hush of the crowd, the weight of the final note lingering in the air before the applause had erupted. It was a moment she had never thought she would experience again. And yet, here she was, staring at an open door she had once believed was locked forever. Her instincts screamed at her to let it go. Music had broken her before. She had loved it, had given everything to it, and when her family lost everything, she had no choice but to leave it behind. It was too painful to hope for something only to have it taken away again. She had spent years convincing herself that her time had passed, that her future was set, that waiting tables was just life now. But that night had reminded her of something she had long buried: the fire, the hunger, the part of her that refused to die. Clara exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. Her fingers twitched, aching for the keys. Would she really walk away again? A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Her best friend and roommate, Maya, stepped inside, carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. She took one look at Clara's expression and sighed knowingly. "You're overthinking it," Maya said, setting a mug in front of her. "Just call him." Clara let out a dry laugh. "It's not that simple." Maya arched a brow. "Why not? He saw what you can do. He wouldn't have given you his card if he didn't believe in you." Clara ran a hand through her curls, her fingers trembling slightly. "What if I'm not good enough anymore? What if I try and fail?" Maya pulled out a chair and sat across from her, her expression softening. "Clara, you already proved yourself. The whole restaurant saw it. The only one doubting you is you." Clara swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. "You didn't let Victor define you," Maya continued. "So, why are you still letting your fear define you?" Silence filled the space between them. Then, slowly, Clara reached for the business card. She turned it over in her fingers, her pulse quickening. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her phone. With one deep breath, she dialed the number. The line rang twice. Then, a warm, professional voice answered. "Dr. Langley speaking." Clara closed her eyes and took the first step toward reclaiming her dream. The rehearsal hall at Juilliard was everything Clara had imagined and more. The room was vast, with towering ceilings and walls lined with portraits of legendary musicians who had once graced these very halls. The air smelled of aged wood and sheet music, a scent she hadn't breathed in years. In the center of the room stood a Steinway grand piano, its polished surface gleaming under the soft light. Dr. Langley sat in a leather chair across from her, studying her with quiet curiosity. He had been kind over the phone, his voice warm yet professional as he invited her to an informal audition. Now he waited. Clara sat at the edge of the polished wooden bench, her hands resting on the cool ivory keys. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it. She took a slow breath, her fingers hovering over the keys. Uncertainty crept in. What if I'm not the same pianist I once was? What if the years of absence have dulled my skill, stolen the precision from my hands? She had spent the past few days practicing on the upright piano at her apartment, rebuilding muscle memory, reconnecting with the music she had abandoned. But this was different. This wasn't just a piano. This wasn't just a song. This was a reckoning. Clara closed her eyes and exhaled. Then she played. The first few notes were hesitant, like a voice rediscovering its strength. But as the melody unfurled, something deep within her awoke. She played Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece that had once been her mother's favorite, one she had played in her childhood home before the world had hardened around her. The melody bloomed under her fingertips, each note carrying a piece of her story. The sacrifice, the struggle, the longing. The soft, achingly beautiful phrases wove through the air, filling the vast space with something more than sound. Emotion, memory, life. She wasn't thinking about Victor. She wasn't thinking about failure. She was simply playing. When the final note faded into silence, Clara's heart pounded in the stillness. She lifted her hands, letting them hover for a moment before lowering them into her lap. And then Dr. Langley leaned forward. For a moment he said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled, a small knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Clara," he said, "you haven't lost a thing." The relief hit her so hard she almost laughed. Instead, she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders loosening for the first time in years. Dr. Langley stood, adjusting the cuff of his blazer. "There's a spot in our program," he said. "I can pull some strings. You'll have to work hard," but he paused, then nodded. "You belong here." A lump formed in Clara's throat. She had spent years believing this world was lost to her. And now, just like that, she had a way back in. Clara stood, her hands still tingling from the performance. For the first time, she let herself believe it. She belonged. Clara's first day at Juilliard felt like stepping into a dream she had long since stopped believing in. The campus buzzed with energy, students rushing to and fro with instrument cases slung over their shoulders, their laughter and chatter filling the air. The halls echoed with the sounds of pianos, violins, and voices warming up, a symphony of ambition and talent. She stood in the middle of it all, clutching her sheet music to her chest, feeling both exhilarated and utterly out of place. The weight of Dr. Langley's words, "You belong here," still lingered in her mind, but the doubt crept in like an old, unwelcome friend. What if I'm not good enough? What if they find out I'm just a waitress who got lucky? Clara Bennett? She turned to see a young woman with fiery red hair and a violin case approaching her. The woman smiled warmly, extending a hand. "I'm Sophie. Dr. Langley asked me to show you around. Welcome to Juilliard." Clara shook her hand, forcing a smile. "Thanks. I'm still trying to process that I'm actually here." Sophie laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Trust me, we all feel that way at first. Come on, I'll introduce you to the practice rooms. You'll be spending a lot of time there." As Sophie led her through the halls, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The practice rooms were small but filled with light, each one housing a grand piano that seemed to hum with potential. Sophie explained the scheduling system, the best times to practice, and the unspoken rules of the music community at Juilliard. "Everyone here is brilliant," Sophie said, her tone matter-of-fact. "But don't let that intimidate you. We're all just trying to figure it out." Clara nodded, but the words did little to ease the knot in her stomach. She had spent years hiding from this world, convincing herself that her dreams were dead. Now, surrounded by so much talent, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake. Her first lesson with Dr. Langley was scheduled for that afternoon. Clara arrived early, her hands trembling as she set her sheet music on the piano. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. She sat at the bench, her fingers brushing the keys, trying to steady her breathing. When Dr. Langley entered, he gave her a reassuring smile. Ready to begin? Clara nodded, though her heart was racing. She played the piece she had prepared, a Chopin nocturne. Her fingers moved with precision, but her mind was elsewhere, filled with doubts and fears. When she finished, she looked up at Dr. Langley, bracing herself for criticism. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Clara, you have a rare gift. Your technique is impeccable, and your emotional connection to the music is extraordinary. But I sense hesitation. What's holding you back? Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the keys. I don't know if I belong here. Everyone else seems so sure of themselves, so confident. I feel like I'm playing catch-up. Dr. Langley nodded, his expression softening. Imposter syndrome is common among artists, especially those who've faced setbacks. But let me ask you this. When you played at the restaurant that night, did you feel like you belonged? Clara thought back to that moment. The way the music had flowed through her, the way the room had fallen silent, the way she had reclaimed a part of herself she thought was lost. Yes, she said quietly. I did. Then trust that feeling, Dr. Langley said. You're not here by chance, Clara. You're here because you earned it. Now, let's work on channeling that confidence into your playing. Over the next few weeks, Clara threw herself into her studies. She spent hours in the practice rooms, her fingers aching from the relentless repetition. She attended masterclasses, soaking up every bit of advice from the visiting professors. She even began collaborating with other students, discovering the joy of making music with others. But the road wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of her past felt unbearable, when the doubts threatened to overwhelm her. On those days, she would sit at the piano, her hands hovering over the keys, and remind herself why she was here. One evening, as she practiced late into the night, Sophie found her in the practice room. You're going to wear out the piano at this rate, she teased, leaning against the doorframe. Clara smiled faintly, her fingers stilling on the keys. I don't want to waste this chance. Sophie stepped into the room, her expression serious. Clara, you're one of the most dedicated people I've ever met. But you can't pour from an empty cup.
Take a break.
Come hang out with us. You're not alone here, you know. Clara hesitated, then nodded. She followed Sophie to a small gathering of students in the common room. They were laughing, sharing stories, and playing impromptu duets. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt a sense of belonging. As the months passed, Clara's confidence grew. She began to see herself not as a waitress who had stumbled into Juilliard, but as a musician who had fought her way back. Her performances became more assured, her connection to the music deeper. She even began composing her own pieces, pouring her emotions into the notes. One day, Dr. Langley approached her after a particularly moving performance. Clara, I'd like you to consider performing at the end of semester recital. It's a big stage, but I believe you're ready. Clara's heart leapt at the opportunity, but the old fears crept in. What if I'm not ready? What if I mess up? Dr. Langley smiled. You're ready, Clara. And even if you do mess up, that's part of the journey. What matters is that you're willing to take the risk. The night of the recital arrived, and Clara stood backstage, her heart pounding. She could hear the murmur of the audience, the rustle of programs, the faint hum of anticipation. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and reminded herself of everything she had overcome. When she walked onto the stage, the spotlight was blinding. She sat at the piano, her fingers finding the keys, and began to play. The music flowed through her, each note a testament to her resilience, her passion, her journey. When she finished, the audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. As she bowed, her eyes scanned the crowd. In the front row, she saw Maya, beaming with pride. Beside her was Sophie, clapping wildly. And in the back, standing quietly, was Victor Kane. His expression was unreadable, but for the first time, Clara didn't care. She had reclaimed her dream, and no one could take that away from her. The applause thundered in Clara's ears as she stood on the stage, her heart pounding with a mix of exhilaration and relief. The spotlight warmed her skin, and for a moment, she allowed herself to bask in the glow of the moment. The audience's cheers were a symphony of validation, a reminder that she had not only reclaimed her dream but had also proven to herself, and to the world, that she was more than the limits others had placed on her. As she stepped off the stage, Maya and Sophie rushed to her side, their faces alight with pride. Maya pulled her into a tight hug, her voice trembling with emotion. "I knew you could do it, Clara." "I always knew." Sophie grinned, clapping her on the back. "You were incredible out there. Seriously, you just set the bar for the rest of us." Clara laughed, her cheeks flushing with a mix of humility and joy. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you both." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, handshakes, and warm smiles. Fellow students, professors, and even strangers approached her, their words of praise blending together in a cacophony of admiration. But amidst the celebration, Clara's thoughts kept drifting to the man she had seen in the back of the hall, Victor Kane. Later that night, as the crowd began to disperse, Clara found herself standing alone in the quiet corridor outside the auditorium. The echoes of the evening's triumph still lingered in the air, but her mind was elsewhere. She had seen Victor's face in the audience, his expression unreadable but undeniably present. Why had he come? What did he want? As if on cue, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Clara turned to see Victor approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. He looked different somehow, less imposing, less sure of himself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Victor broke the silence. That was quite a performance. Clara crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "Thank you. I didn't expect to see you here." Victor hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. "I heard about the recital. I wanted to see for myself." Clara raised an eyebrow. "See what? That I wasn't just a waitress you could humiliate?" Victor flinched, his jaw tightening. "I didn't come here to argue. I came to apologize." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Clara studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all she saw was a man stripped of his usual bravado. "I was wrong," Victor continued, his voice quieter now. "What I did that night at the restaurant, it was cruel. I didn't know your story, and even if I had, it wouldn't have excused my behavior. You didn't deserve that." Clara's chest tightened, a flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. For so long, she had carried the weight of his actions, the humiliation, the anger. But now, standing here, she realized that his apology didn't hold the power she had once thought it did. She had already moved beyond him, beyond the pain he had caused. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "But I don't need your apology to validate me. I've already proven to myself and to everyone else that I'm more than what you tried to make me believe." Victor nodded, his expression a mixture of regret and respect. "You have. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't let me stop you." Clara offered him a small, genuine smile. "Me too." As Victor walked away, Clara felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. The past no longer held her captive. She had reclaimed her story, her music, and her future. In the months that followed, Clara's career soared. She performed in sold-out concert halls, her name once again whispered with admiration in the world of classical music. But her success wasn't just about the accolades or the applause. It was about the lives she touched along the way. She began mentoring young musicians, sharing her story of resilience and hope. She visited schools in underserved communities, bringing music to children who had never had the chance to play an instrument. She even started a foundation to provide scholarships for aspiring artists who, like her, had faced seemingly insurmountable obstacles. One evening, as she sat backstage after another triumphant performance, Clara received a letter from a young girl named Emma. The letter was filled with gratitude, describing how Clara's story had inspired Emma to pursue her own dreams of becoming a pianist. At the bottom of the page, Emma had drawn a small heart next to the words, "Thank you for showing me that no dream is too big." Clara held the letter to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. This was her legacy, not the awards or the fame, but the lives she had touched, the dreams she had reignited. Years later, Clara returned to Le Jardin Étoile, not as a waitress, but as a guest of honor. The restaurant had changed, but the piano still stood in the corner, a silent witness to the night that had changed everything. As she sat at the keys, her fingers brushed the cool ivory, and she felt a wave of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. She began to play, the melody flowing through her like an old friend. The room fell silent, the guests captivated by the music and the woman who had once been invisible but now shone brighter than ever. As the final note faded, Clara rose from the bench, her heart full. She had come full circle, but this was not the end. It was a new beginning, a reminder that no matter how far she had come, there were still more dreams to chase, more lives to touch, and more music to make. And so, Clara Bennett's story continued, a testament to the power of resilience, the beauty of second chances, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. She had risen above her past, not just for herself, but for everyone who dared to dream.